Do you ever wonder who really struggles with mental health? Let's chat about it. Welcome back to the Reflection Room. I am actually so excited to be back with you guys. It's been a few weeks since I've been able to sit down and record something. And if you're familiar with our channel so far, then you would notice that we alternate therapists. And so it gives you guys a little bit of a break from one particular phase. And then also it allows you to have different perspectives on just mental health issues. And we're all different as therapists. And so it just mixes things up a little bit. But I did miss you guys. I'm so excited to share a little bit about what's been on my mind. I feel like all of my videos are like super random. So today, actually, let's see, last time I talked about Blue's Clues. And so today, it's a little bit more adult-like, our topic, but I was actually reading, I came across an article online on the Billboard's music website. I guess they have, I don't know, like a health section or no, I think it was a music news. That's what it was. They have a column that's called Music News. There was an article on there that was talking a little bit about mental health and the specific like musicians, artists that have actually come out and talked a little bit about mental health. And so, of course, it just piqued my interest. And so I got to reading the article and I thought it was super interesting. And I thought, why not share a little bit of, my thoughts as I was reading through that article, which I thought was well written. Essentially, it was just going through and talking about the different stories that a lot of our modern day musicians and artists have shared regarding their struggles with mental health. And I thought this was really good too, because like good timing, because when this is being recorded, not necessarily when it's being watched, but World Mental Health Day actually was just passed. It was a few days ago. And so I thought it was really timing to talk a little bit about this and mental health, the topic of mental health, but not only that specifically, but really how it permeates our culture. And there are no demographics whatsoever that prevent mental health from really infiltrating and affecting various subgroups. So as I was reading through one of the stories there was related to Brian Welch, which was I want to say the head singer for Korn. Don't quote me on that. I wasn't a big Korn fan. I was more of an NSYNCer. But anyways, I've actually run into his story quite a few times because he talks a little bit about the transformation that he's made, not only with mental health, but then also his spiritual walk and journey as well. I think his story is really interesting, very intriguing. But anyways, there was a section on there that talked about him and his story, and he said something that really stood out for me. He said, I know what it feels like to be at the bottom of a pit, but I also know what it's like to do the work and to see the light come on. And I thought, gosh, like how many people can actually relate to the way that he described that in a very simplistic, very concrete, relational way. And so it got me thinking about some of the myths that exist when it comes to mental health, pathology, disorders, the whole gamut. And I thought, why not talk a little bit about the specific myth that certain types of people experience mental health issues, that there's a subgroup or a certain type of person that struggles with mental health. And so I was just in the mood to debunk this specific myth. So I want to talk a little bit about ways to explore this myth and possibly talk a little bit about where that might come from, but then also give my twist on it. And if you were sitting across from me in a counseling session, what I would say to you if you shared with me that you were feeling a bit either ashamed or embarrassed about mental health struggles, maybe something that you were struggling with. Recent stats actually shows that 1 in 5 people worldwide struggle with mental health problems, struggle with a mental health illness. So if you think about that, like around 24 to 20, no, I think the number is 22%. There we go. So it's like between 20 and 22% of people around us when we're interacting with family members, when we're in the workplace, when we're visiting a doctor's office, when we're in church, when we are on I don't know, the field playing, volleyball or baseball or whatever. Just the thought that 1 in 5 people are struggling with some kind of mental health problem. It just really blows my mind of how prevalent a lot of these struggles really are. So when I think about where this comes from, this myth that only a certain type of person struggles with mental health, I don't know exactly where this stems from. I don't really think there's one specific answer. I think it depends on the society that we're talking about, the culture that we're discussing, even the specific family unit that we're taking into consideration. But like a lot of things that come to mind include one, societal expectations. This idea that, for example, women are to be seen and not heard, or boys don't cry, that kind of thing where it gets embedded very early on for some of us, whether it's from societal expectations or maybe the way that we were raised within our family, or even taking into consideration some cultural context, that we believe even though I'm feeling a certain way inside, I feel like the expectation is that I show up this way. And so we tend to change the way that we maybe present ourselves or show up in certain settings or spaces, even though how we're presenting doesn't necessarily match what we're feeling on the inside. I think another thing that comes to mind too, when I think about exploring this myth and just wondering where that comes from, I don't know about you guys, but I know that I've come across certain people either in the counseling setting or even in my personal life. And if I'm honest, I probably struggled with this a little bit myself personally, where there's this idea or belief that strength has to look a certain way. And so in order to be strong, and by that mentally or emotionally strong, then we can't express ourselves a certain way or can't allow emotions to seep through in a certain way. Because if we do, then it's seen as weak or seen as some kind of weakness that we have. And so I think that our definition of what strength actually looks like sometimes can perpetuate a stereotype like that. And then the other thing that comes to mind too, I can't talk about stereotypes and societal expectations and leave out any kind of mention of media and how media depicts gender roles or certain stereotypes or certain expectations, and even how it depicts mental health. When I think about, can't forget those Disney movies. So when I think about how men or women are depicted in a lot of these movies, I think about how women are sometimes this idea of hysterical or are in distress, and the way that distress is handled or managed or resolved is if there is some kind of person that sweeps in and saves the day. Or I think about how often do we see men shown as crying or having a moment of transparency and openness, maybe more so lately. I'm thinking about all of the other millennials that are out there that shared a very similar upbringing. I think about some of the things that I saw growing up, and I don't know if I could really think about situations where men or boys were shown as being open about some of the things that they're struggling with. I think about them getting angry or aggressive, or gosh, what is that guy's name from Beauty and the Beast? Oh, it's like at the tip of my tongue. But anyways, there's like a whole song in the beginning about it where he's this like strong, rough guy or whatever, right? I can't think of a situation where they have shown men to be comforting and nurturing and soft. And that's what we grow up seeing. And that, along with our parents or caretakers or whoever's in our lives early on, those are the people that model for us what it's like to express ourselves, communicate, be open about our emotions and our struggles and our needs and our sensitivities and our pain points and all of that. So those are some of the things that kind of come to mind. I think the last thing that I feel like contributes to some of these myths or stereotypes specifically about mental health, I think it's just purely a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding or education. I can't tell you how many times people will sometimes come into our counseling sessions, and I say ours because we, as therapists, it was something that we really try to prioritize our consultation meetings, where we're not talking specifically about clients and their details or sharing anything about that, but we are trying to make sure that as we talk about cases that we're not having tunnel vision, but we're considering all factors that might be contributing to whatever the person is struggling with. And so sometimes we do have those consultation meetings and we talk a little bit about our cases. And something that comes up a lot is just the misinformation that's put out there about mental health. So for example, sometimes people will think that they'll describe someone, a family member, let's say, as bipolar because they fly off the handle, or they get upset really easily, or they struggle to control their emotions. But in reality, that's not the clinical definition of a bipolar diagnosis or even depression. When we think of depression, we think of, typically in our culture, someone who cries a lot or maybe is unmotivated to get things done on a day-to-day basis, or just their life just lacks color and they experience a world of grayness. But yes, in some cases, in other cases, specifically, let's say with a lot of men that might struggle with depression, the way that manifests is very different than the way it would manifest for women or for children. And then we also have to take into consideration cultural context and family dynamics. And so there's so many things that impact the way that mental health struggles or illnesses are expressed in people. And so I think that's the other thing, that if I had to identify some things that contribute to some of these myths that we sometimes either see online, social media, or in shows, I think that those would probably be my reasons for that. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a therapeutic perspective to the topic that we're talking about. And I wanted to highlight something. I wanted to talk about the topic of vulnerability. Oftentimes we feel like if we express our struggles, then it's seen as a weakness. But I want to reframe or give a new perspective or give some insight into that process of expressing one's struggles. And that word is vulnerability. There is a quote that I love. Brene Brown, by the way. If you have not read any of her books, I highly recommend them. There's so many that are so good, but there's one specifically that's called Dare Greatly, I think. Oh gosh, I wish I would have had the title somewhere. I don't know. I think it's Dare Greatly or Dare to Be Great. I definitely will include it at the bottom of this video once I look it up. But in that book, and overall, she specializes in vulnerability, specifically Brene. And she says, vulnerability sounds like truth and courage. And truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they are definitely not weaknesses. So I love that definition, because when you think about the word truth, when you think about someone who's truthful or someone who is honest, someone who's open, and someone who's willing to talk about the hard things, I don't think about weakness at all. I think about someone who is exhibiting a level of bravery and something that is admirable, as something that I would model myself after. And when I think about the word courage, it's very similar. I think about someone who's willing to take risks, recognizing that there might be some either pushback or some consequences to that, but they're willing to step out, take a risk, and see, what's on the other side of that. So when I think about truth and I think about courage, the last thing that comes to my mind is weakness. So why is it that when we think about vulnerability and being open about our struggles or our needs, then the word weakness comes to mind? So I wanted to encourage you all to lean into this idea of being more vulnerable with people that we're in relationship with. Maybe it's a therapist that you see that you've been a little bit hesitant and maybe holding back from opening up because you're afraid of what he or she might think of you. Being more open and vulnerable in the workplace. Again, I do want to share, obviously, there's a time and a place for things. We do want to operate from a place of wisdom with who we're opening up with and who we're sharing things with. But I did want to encourage you guys to lean into vulnerability. As I was thinking about this conversation with you guys, it got me thinking about whether or not people even really know if they are being vulnerable or open. I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we know as people when we're struggling with vulnerability in a specific setting or a specific relationship. So there are a few things I wanted to go over. The first one is, and I will say these are generalizations, right? So they may not apply to everyone, but I just want to throw some things out there that might be food for thought. So first, what comes to mind is someone who struggles with perfectionism. Now, again, there may be various reasons why somebody struggles with perfectionism, but one of those reasons could potentially be that we are afraid of someone seeing any failures or signs of weakness or witnessing any mistakes that we make. And so in order to hide that or to mask our flaws, we then feel the need to show up in a way where all of those holes have been plugged, all of those cracks have been filled, and we're showing up as our best selves. But really behind that sometimes is this fear of somebody seeing the real us, the real me, the real you. So one is that. One question I would ask is, do you struggle with perfectionism? A second thing that comes to mind is people who struggle with being vulnerable oftentimes don't stop to ask for help. Again, it's very similar to perfectionism, but there's this idea that I can't let someone know that I'm struggling in this area because they might think X, Y, and Z about me. So instead, I'd rather just suffer in silence, hopefully come up with some kind of solution to my problem. And sometimes we do come up with an answer and issues get resolved on our own, handling it on our own. But a lot of times that prevents people from collaborating with us and connecting with us. Sometimes it will take longer when we could have resolved the issue faster had we asked for help and been open about what we were struggling with. So I have perfectionism. I have don't ask for help. I have the other thing that comes to mind is keeping people at a distance. Now, this one's a tough one because there could be a number of reasons why people keep people at a distance. Sometimes it's because of our past experiences. A lot of times it's because of our past experiences. We've not had the healthiest interactions with people, and maybe we've been disappointed, we've been hurt before, and so there's this fear of that happening again. And so our ideal is if I can just keep someone at arm's length, then I can see them a little better. I know where they're coming from. And I'm going to share a story about that in a second. But that would be another reason why, just to think about, do I tend to keep people at a distance? Do I stiff arm people? And if so, what's my reason behind that? Is it because I'm struggling to be fully open and transparent with people? And then the fourth one is just not sharing. Now, actually, let me share a story about this. Now that I think about it, for various reasons, I struggled with this for some time, just being vulnerable and open. Go figure, a therapist. But I will never forget this moment. So I was let me back up, in our grad program for counseling. There's a class that at least we had to take in our program. I don't know if all programs are like that, but the class was group therapy. And it is really what it sounds like. Literally, the class was like a therapy group. and we would take turns like leading the group, and it's cloudy now exactly how it worked. I think we would come up with our own topics or something like that. I don't know. But this part isn't cloudy at all. I remember it very clearly. So it was probably a few weeks in, maybe 3-4 weeks in. And you know how we're all creatures of habit, like we all would sit like in the same chair in the circle or whatever. So there was another student, a woman that was next to me that would always sit next to me, and her and I would have basic conversation as we like sat down, got our stuff out, got ready for class. And anyway, so this specific day, another student who was leading the group, and they called on her, and she was going to share something personal. It's something that was like a sensitive topic. She was going to be open about something, and she starts and then she stops. And then she says, I'm struggling to be open and trust the group because there are some people in here who haven't opened up about anything. And I just remember thinking like, oh, that's weird. And then all of a sudden she looks at me and she was like, Natalie, you're one of those people. And I just was like, so taken aback because I was in my own world. Like the way I was raised because of just my cultural background, you weren't really trained or modeled to talk about these like personal issues outside of the home, nor did we really talk about them inside the home either, if I'm being honest. But I just didn't really think there was anything wrong with that. And I remember my first reaction, silently, of course, but I was like, what does me not sharing have to do with you sharing? That doesn't make any sense. But as we talked about it, as she talked about it there, then her and I talked about it privately. And then I actually talked to my professor about it afterwards. I realized that people oftentimes feel safest when they feel like there is this reciprocity within the relationship where they feel comfortable letting their walls down if they know that the other person is just as invested in the relationship, because then they feel like, okay, that person's being open and sharing, then they're going to understand the risk that it takes in order to be open and share. And so they're going to handle what I'm sharing in a very delicate way. So I thought that always sticks with me. And after that, like now I have no problem sharing, but in the moment I was just like taken aback, but it was actually one of the greatest lessons I think I've ever learned. Yeah. So that would be the other thing. I think that one can ask oneself, like, do I struggle to share details with people about my thoughts, my fears, my worries, challenges that I'm having, concerns, anything that's happening within a relationship that we are struggling to manage? And so if the answer is yes, then I'm not saying it's a guarantee. There might be some struggles there with being vulnerable. So I did want to share a little metaphor with you guys, and I'm hoping that if nothing else sticks, this will stick. A lot of times we feel like if we, not literally, figuratively speaking, if we lock ourselves up in a room, let's say, meaning like we don't open up our hearts, we are very guarded, like essentially all mental, emotional, spiritual doors are shut, and we don't let people in, there's this sometimes false sense of comfort that comes because initially we're feeling safe, knowing that no one can get to me. I mentioned earlier about hurt and disappointment and past pain. And naturally, anytime people are interacting anywhere, whether it's family, work, friendship circles, it gets messy just because life has its ups and downs and we're all struggling with something. And so we think, okay, if I've closed all of those doors, meaning I'm guarding myself, then I'm preventing myself from getting hurt again, is probably the thing, or getting hurt the third time or the fourth time or the fifth time. And I can understand that. I've been there personally many times. I think that's our human desire, just like naturally, is to just respond that way, to want to protect ourselves from whatever we find to be very threatening outside. But what ends up happening is that as you've locked yourself up in this cocoon or this space that we think is safe or comforting, if I were to ask you guys to think about who is the prisoner, the person who's confined within those four walls, or the people that are outside, like living their life and in relationship with people and connecting with others, the reality is that the person that is trying to maintain this false sense of comfort and safety actually finds themselves being the prisoner. And I hope that helps someone out there understand that although it feels good for a short period of time, it doesn't meet our underlying need to connect with people. If any of you guys are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in there in the middle somewhere is the need to belong. So I thought that this topic was very important to talk about because sometimes if we're struggling with stuff, it doesn't even have to be a mental illness, but just like struggling with challenges or just problems, we think to ourselves, I can't share that with anyone because people might think that I'm weak or I'm negative or I don't know, I'm always a problem, like I'm a walking problem or whatever the case may be. And a lot of those stereotypes or misconceptions come from societal expectations, our family and cultural contexts, and even, as I mentioned, some of those ridiculous media depictions. And by doing that, we think that we're protecting ourselves, but in reality, we're imprisoning ourselves. So I wanted to, hopefully that's an encouragement for someone, but I wanted to give some kind of challenge, as we always do, to people who are tuning in and listening. I wanted to encourage you guys to do two things. One is to show up, and the other is to allow yourself to be seen. Now, let's not think about the other people's responses and their opinions and their perspective and their thoughts on all of that. Let's just take it one step at a time. And the challenge is to show up and to allow yourself to be seen. Thank you so much for joining me. I love these moments. I feel like I just get to share whatever's going on up here in this head of mine. And it's a really good feeling. So thank you again for tuning in. And until next time, keep reflecting.